This is nuts.
So one night, when I was a young child, I don't remember what age I was, but we were living in New Jersey, so I must have been around 5 or 6 years old. And my dad woke me up in the middle of the night, and he said, "Come with me."
Sylvia, come on. We're going on a little adventure. Sylvia, Brad, come on, get up.
And I was really groggy. I remember my dad got me in the car. He said, "I have a surprise for you." And he drove me a while, and we drove to this field. And we got out of the car, and I kept saying, "Dad, what time is it?" And he kept saying, "It's the middle of the night." He didn't say what they said. It's the middle of the night. And there were all these people in this field, several dozen. And my dad brought a picnic blanket, and he put the blanket out on this grassy knoll, and we laid on the blanket, and we looked up at the sky. There was this fantastic meteor shower, like the Perseus meteor shower that we have sometimes. And I just remember looking up at the sky, and every 15 to 20 seconds, there was a fantastic of light across the sky. And I think that was my first introduction to the world beyond the earth. That probably first impregnated me with wanting to tell stories not of this world. Yeah, I was very influenced by J. Allen Hynek because he was not looking at UFOs as science fiction, but he was looking at them as science speculation.
And he was employed by the government for Project Blue Book for 20 years, investigating all of these UFO things that were so big in the 50s.
In a nutshell, Hynek was a disbeliever who became a believer.
He found the witness reports very credible, and he found so many similarities from so many portions of America as well as throughout the world that he became a convert to the fact that the government was hiding something and something was afoot.
At the end of it, the government disbanded Project Blue Book and said no evidence of any kind, of any sort. And Dr. Hynek said, who was very much a skeptic and wanted to be a disbeliever because that was the scientific approach, Dr. Hynek said they had several hundred cases of absolutely unexplained UFOs. He didn't say what they were, he wasn't saying they were from outer space, but he said we came across stuff there was no possible way of debunking some of these things. It was unexplainable.
So I met with him, and I used him, and I picked his brain, and he consulted with me. He's even in the movie in a snippet of a scene in the third act. And I owe a lot to his instilling in me a professional's point of view on this kind of field reporting. And he helped me make the movie more credible than it would have been without his existence.
The term Close Encounter of the Third Kind is taken from Dr. Alan J. Hynek's book. He's who created the term Close Encounters.
Well, a close encounter of the first kind is one is close, but nothing really happened.
Close encounter of the first kind is visible contact with a UFO.
Forget the shape and forget how fast it's going. It's something that you just can't explain.
Close encounters of the second kind are those which leave a physical trace. Holes in the ground,
Burn rings,
broken tree branches,
telephone lines down,
animals disturbed.
the stopping of car engines.
And the close encounters of the third kind are the most interesting of all.
Close encounter of the third kind is really when you meet them.
Well, I had a lot of scenarios for hanging a UFO story on. I mean, I had a lot of premises on which to hang the UFO mythology, and one of them, of course, was that it was a story about a police officer. Police officers make very credible witnesses, and when they say they've seen something, you tend to believe them. I mean, at one point, I even thought that the character should be a military person, a debunker working for Project Blue Book.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a flying saucer.
But anytime I feel a character's in a uniform, they're not who we are. We don't identify with people in uniform. Sometimes we admire them and want to be like them, like Tom Cruise in Top Gun, but we don't really relate to people in uniform as Martha's Vineyard in whatever year we were shooting that in. I guess that was in the early in 73 or 74. I told Richard the story of Close Encounters.
We were all hanging out together during the making of Jaws, and he was telling us about this next project that he was going to do, and he had meetings occasionally with the writers and his other producing partners, I guess. And he one night told me this story. At the time, the story was about an army guy.
The title wasn't Close Encounters in those days, but I told him I wanted to make a movie about, about UFOs.
There were some mornings when I would accompany Steven to his office and help him with the story of this next film. still not thinking anything about my participating in it until one day, I don't remember now exactly what happened, one day it became quickly or clearly evident to me that all of the thinking that Steven had been doing about this character was wrong, and that I was going to guide him into the light as to what actor should play this role.
And you know, it's funny, when you've got your guy right in front of you, sometimes you can't see your own hand in front of your face. And as Richard kept saying, I really want to play this character, please let me play this character, I tended to move on because I kept seeing him as the ichthyologist, Hooper in Jaws, and I couldn't see beyond the character that he was playing for me in the current production. So I looked in other directions, and I remember my first choice was Steve McQueen. I remember calling Steve McQueen on the phone. I'd never met him before, and I called him and introduced myself to him, and I said, I'm making this UFO movie. I'd love you to play the lead. Would you read the script? And he was very cool about it. He said, I certainly would. So I sent him over the script, and then he, through his agent, he asked to meet with me. And I went to meet with Steve McQueen in Trancas, California, where he had a house. And he wanted to meet me at a bar called the Doom Room. I've never been to a bar in my life. It was the first bar I'd ever really gone into. And I remember he tried to break up a kind of fisticuffs in the bar and almost got involved himself. And I think only because I was there, he didn't get involved. But we talked about it for a while, and eventually he said to me something that I'll never forget. He said, I've decided I can't play this character. And I thought I had him, because I even had 3 beers to his 14. You know what I'm saying? I was drinking the best I could. I don't drink. I mean, alcohol to me, half a glass of wine, I get a little ditzy. But Steve finally told me he couldn't play the character, and I said, why? He said, because I can't cry on film. I've never been able to cry on film. And this character, the way you have in your script, it even says he walks up and he turns, looks at his family, and he cries as he goes onto the mothership. And I said, okay, I'll cut out the crying. I'll cut out the crying part. He said, no. He said, the crying broke my heart. The crying actually almost made me cry reading the script. But he said, but once that camera's rolling, I don't think I'm going to be able to deliver the goods to you. And I respectfully have to, say I can't do it. And it broke my heart. But we became kind of friends after that, so I got something out of the experience. I got to know him, and who I had truly admired, an actor and a physical actor, and also thought a very emotional actor, who I had always admired and never gotten to know, and I got to know him a little bit, and that was a privilege. So I went to Dustin Hoffman. He turned me down. I went to Al Pacino. I went to Gene Hackman. I went to a lot of actors who said no.
I launched myself on this campaign of bad-mouthing every actor in Hollywood in order to get this part. When I knew that he was an everyman, when I knew that he was a family man and that he was not an insider but an outsider going through this experience, I really began this effort. And I would walk by Steven's office and say things like, Al Pacino has no sense of humor, or Jack Nicholson's crazy, or whatever I had to say. I didn't care.
I pretty much confided in him of the other actors I was talking to, and he told me they're either going to say no or they're wrong for the part.
And on the day that I said to him, you need a child, that's what you need for this part, he looked up and he said, you got the part. And he knew that he did need someone who could be a child and yet a man. And I think that's really what persuaded him.
But Richard was great for the part because Richard is every person. If I wanted to put myself in one of my own movies, I sort of go to Richard. I felt that I was the ichthyologist in Jaws, and Richard played me in that. And I felt that I was Neary in Close Encounters, and Richard played me in that. And I also felt that I was the character in Always, and Richard played me in that also. I'm not saying that I'm the actor trying to throw myself in these roles, but when I identify with a character, I'd like to find someone that thinks like me and jokes around like me. And Richard and I have been such good friends for so many years, and we are in such agreement on so many things about just life and politics and raising families and things like this. And I mean, to me, it's an honor that he steps into roles that I identify closer to than other parts I don't cast him in. I perhaps don't identify with that role as much.
The biggest reason, aside from wanting to work with Steven again, was that I felt, as did everybody, we all felt that this particular project had a noble agenda. This was a big idea that Steven was talking about. It wasn't just a sci-fi movie, and it wasn't just about monsters from the id, and it wasn't this. It was that we are not only not alone, but that we have relatively little to fear.
My main reason for casting Francois, and it was a pipe dream. Everybody has their wish list. You know, you put the impossible dream at the top of the list and you work your way down to the more practical choices. And he was in the very top of my list, but mainly because I had seen him in Wild Child, and I felt he was such a tremendous human presence in that film. He just radiated so much compassion. And I felt that rather than putting the face of government on this movie, the face of bureaucracy on the characters that were on the government side, I wanted to put the image of government on all the vehicles and all the bureaucracy. But I wanted the face that led the way to be extremely charitable and kind and optimistic. And Truffaut came into my mind like a snap of a finger. And I remember calling him and getting him on the phone in Paris, and through his assistant who spoke English, she interpreted for us. I asked him if he would read my script that I had written myself, and he was impressed the fact that I had written the script myself and I was going to direct it because he's written so many of his own scripts. And he said, yes, please send it to me, which was in English, by the way. And I sent him the script, and 3 days later I got a telegram where he said, please send somebody over so I can talk about my wardrobe. That was sort of contained in the telegram. That was the way he said yes.
I remember being told one day that Francois Truffaut was going to play the part of the doctor. And the whole movie took a notch up, you know. Steven took a notch up. The studio took a notch up because he was so, and is so, extraordinary a figure. It said something amazing and reconfirming about our attitude of what Close Encounters was all about. If Close Encounters just a science fiction movie, Francois Truffaut never would have done that. But he also recognized the noble ambition of that film. That's why he said yes.
I think that Francois Truffaut, for the mass market audience in the United States, was not well known because French films in French have never had an easy time of it, and they're always art films, basically. But the large number of people who did know who he was were in awe of him, basically, as was everybody on the movie. I mean, Richard certainly was, Dreyfuss, and I know when they all met him, they all would come to me and say, you know, like, we're scared, you know, what's happening? I said, he's really nice, guys, you know, don't be afraid. He doesn't speak English, so he's going to seem kind of stern and nervous, but it's just because he doesn't speak, but he really likes you all. And I was kind of like translating back and forth.
He only thought and breathed and lived about films, Truffaut, and so that's everything that he talked about, the behavior on the set, what producers should and should not say to crew members, what this should happen, what that should. I mean, he had everything down in terms of movies, who did what.
I know Francois Truffaut went up to Steven in the beginning of the movie and made it very clear. He said, you know, I'm here to be an actor in this movie. I'm not a director. You just tell me what to do, sir, and I'll do anything you say. And it was completely like that during the movie.
He loved the idea of working for Steven. He was so happy to be there because he had made Jaws, and this was such a great, energetic movie, and he had such great things to say about everybody. And he was completely in love with the cinema and filmmaking. He's just completely soaked in it. That's what his life was all about. I remember I was in when I was a dancer, in a very, very obscure movie called Red Line 7000. And I was telling him about it. He says, I know the movie. It was Howard Hawks' last movie. It had James Caan. It had so-and-so. It had he knew everybody in it. I was a singing waitress in it. I know the scene that you are in. It has a girl doing the fake French. It had He knew everything. He was steeped in it up to his eyeballs. I said, you know, don't you ever sleep, or do you just watch TV and movies all the time? I think that's what he did.
Francois Truffaut was already famous for his admiration of children. And I was no exception. I remember him being very affectionate, just very kind and very loving.
Some of the grown-ups on the set were frightened of him because of his stature, basically. But to kids, he was like, you know, children have that ability to just look at somebody and tell if they're friendly and if they're kid-friendly. And they knew right away. And he was like the Pied Piper.
I'm not certain that 2001 inspired me more than that it intimidated me, because it was such a great movie. Of course, you know, one of the things that impressed me about 2001 were those amazing visual effects, and I got the list of everybody responsible for it, and of all the people whose names were credited, the one person who lived in Los Angeles was Doug Trouble. The rest of them were British. And Colin was in Los Angeles also. I remember Colin was one of the first people I ever met, Colin Cantwell. And Colin did the very, very first CGI test in history for Close Encounters, and actually on a computer generated 3 flying discs with lights flying across a football stadium, all computer generated. It might have been the first, for a movie, computer generated test ever done. And it was extraordinary, but it still wasn't up to both the artistry and the technology that the supercomputers at a much cheaper price were able to supply to Hollywood 15, 18 years later. So we were, I thought, really 18 years ahead of our time with Colin Cantwell and his opening tests. As Colin continued to dabble in the CGI world, Doug came on and just said, hey, look, let's get practical. We got to have to use models. And we're going to do it the old-fashioned way, but we're going to do it in a different way. We're going to use motion control. I said, what's motion control? He said, that will allow you to pan and tilt and dolly and still lock the effects in the frame exactly where you want them. I said, really? He said, yeah. And that impressed me.
Historically in the movie business, it's been very hard to match the movement of the camera. So most often in any kind of a matte shot or composite shot of a foreground and background, the camera would be locked off. It simply wouldn't move. Then things would line up. Close Encounters was the first film ever to use.
In my imagination, they had made this tremendous stadium on the other side of Devil's Tower. And I wanted the stadium to be like 1,000 feet long, maybe 1,500 feet long, and maybe even longer than that. Like, it was almost like a runway for UFOs. And I kind of spitballed the entire ending of the movie based on the Joe Alves design of the base of operations or the landing zone. I wasn't looking to build the biggest set of all time. I just remember thinking, we can't shoot outside because if it rains, we're messed up. We can't shoot in the rain. So I began looking for the biggest indoor enclosure. Looked all over the world.
We found one up in Tillamook, Oregon, and we all flew up there. And this thing was 300 feet wide and 900 feet long and about 90 feet high. And it would have worked fine, except Georgia Pacific had occupied a section of it, and it wasn't going to work in conjunction with their activity too well. In other words, they'd be having saws going while we were trying to shoot.
And there were a lot of huge indoor enclosures where they built rocket ships and they built big 747s, but nothing that didn't have center dividers, spoiling that big openness. The only place in the world that was big enough for the set that did not have center dividers was on this disused Air Force base in Mobile, Alabama, where they used to make World War II blimps, dirigibles.
Finally, someone came up with this place in Mobile, Alabama, which was 300 by 300. And it was fine. It wasn't big enough, but the doors opened up all the way, so we could extend it. We had to extend the back section of the set by building a huge scaffold, and the scaffold was about 8 stories high, and then we made this incredible large black background thing, which took like 4 months to make.
And that was really the ideal place for us because it was big, and Joe could build his set there, and it looked really like the real location, actually. It was amazingly beautifully built.
We had Devil's Tower, and we had an encampment there. We had sort of like a trailer city. So all these units would have to be in sort of module, movable kind of pods. And that's the design we came up with. They weren't actually modeled after anything, but we talked to the Houston people and said, what would you do if an alien ship would arrive? And what kind of equipment would you have? So we built these various modules, and we were able to rent a lot of equipment that went inside these little...
He said, instead of being relieved, all I could think of was, he gave somebody else my line. He said, it's the only thing I could think of during this thing. He said, I think I know what it's like to be an actor now. I think I have a real insight into this thing that actors go through.
It had never occurred to him, some of the pluses and minuses of acting, and how you approach a role given the circumstances of having no other obligations. I would imagine that he could probably come away from that experience with an enhanced respect for film acting, and at the same time a degraded respect for film acting.
We were in this huge airplane hangar in Mobile, Alabama, where the temperature was 120 degrees, and we had weeks and weeks and weeks of standing around. and pointing up at the sky and pretending things were there, and we were so hot. And if you had to be encased in any of those modules where they were with the scientists, which I was occasionally, it could be 140 degrees in those things. In fact, I'm not sure if it was a rumor, but the hangar was so big and it was so hot around the lights, but it was cooler towards the top. There was a rumor that it could start to rain at any point.
The conditions that we worked under ranged from fun to frightening. And part of the shoot was a simple nightmare.
We had these incredible storms. I mean, we would have these unbelievable summer storms. I mean, lightning, if you've been in the South, you know what I'm talking about. And I heard this crack of thunder, and I walked deep into the set, and suddenly a little pinhole of light appeared. And then it got bigger, and then it just exploded.
In the entire south half of the hangar, while we were shooting, we're looking over there going, look, look, suddenly the hangar blew off. I mean, literally the entire side of this thing, I don't know, 95 feet high, 150 feet wide, just went flying off into the air, exposing us to the elements.
And it just blew the set apart, which was pretty sad, and which made us then go into a night orbit where we had to shoot everything at night until we could repair that. Steven had so many ideas, and he had these ideas of these little cubes, like just little light cubes is what they were, and they preceded the aliens, and they would sort of look around, sort of to check things out. And so these streams of little cubicles that flew around and sort of childlike, you know, played around the cameraman and the various scientific little cubicles and stuff. And they were just these delightful things. It was like square Tinkerbell dust.
And so there were cuboid tests photographed, and then there were a few live action shots done where we rigged these little square boxes that were little wireframe boxes with very bright light bulbs inside with plastic scrim on them, and rigged them in wires for what was going to be just some of the coverage and close-ups in that sequence. And even I was photographed as one of the technicians in a little cameo. But none of us could ever figure out how to make that sequence work. It would definitely require today's level of sophistication of computer graphics. It would be easy to do it today. Then it was not possible.
Steven said to me at one point, no matter how high the budget of a movie, you always leave that day wishing you had gotten 3 more shots and wishing you could have fixed one shot or another shot. And at one point at the end, when we were shooting the spaceship with the loud noises, there's a sequence in which a window blows out, a huge sugar glass window. It's like 4 feet by 8 feet. And they weren't going to do it at all, because if you did it once, you had to have like 5 pieces of glass, because you had to do it a number of times, shot from different angles. What if it didn't go well the first time? And I heard this little whispering on the side. And it turned out later on that Steven said it was so important to him that have that insert of the glass breaking to signify the power of the sound, that Steven had gone over and negotiated that he personally was going to pay for those pieces.
This was before the age of wire removal, digital wire removal, and unless you could light it, so none of those wires showed up, there was no way to get rid of the wires. And I did a test on that, and no matter how they lit it, they'd have to gobo all the wires. We were going to have big arcs. We had almost 80 arcs on that in that dirigible hangar. There was no way you can gobo 60 puppeteers with like 500 strings, and that was just impossible. You could almost project visually how that wouldn't, be workable. So I threw that out, and my last idea was to actually have little girls, because they move differently than little boys, much more gracefully, in costume. And we just tried to reshape the configuration of their bodies a bit, so they wouldn't look too human, and that's what it wound up being. And also by backlighting it and letting the camera flirt with the aliens and the aliens flirt with the camera.
And Steven decided that when we shot the aliens to really not show them too much. We shot them in silhouettes, and we shot them with a lot of lights, overexposing them. So he just wanted to create shapes and a mystery about them rather than really showing them.
We had different pools of the kids who were playing the extraterrestrials, and a lot of them dropped out because they started working months and months before the actual sequence. Susan Heldfond was the movement coach.
She was wonderful. She really was a dancer, and she was able to train all of these little girls, or about 60 or 70 of them, how to move and how to walk, and she did a wonderful job making almost like a dance troupe.
the extraterrestrials were supposed to, and this never really worked out, they were supposed to move very, very quickly. Now, they were going to shoot the extraterrestrials at a lower speed so that it would appear that the action was all speeded up. So the extraterrestrials, to accentuate this, they were all supposed to shuffle their feet and move their hands like this and move really jumpy. Then when the film was speeded up, they would be so fast, they would be like flies buzzing around. It would be so exciting. Well, in the meantime, they simultaneously trained a bunch of mimes who were pretending to be technicians, American, from Earth technicians. So the mimes would run over to see the extraterrestrials in slow motion, so that when the camera was sped up, they would get to be correct, and the extraterrestrials who were going like this, fast hands, fast feet, they'd yell, they would get even faster, and it would all be this perfect blend. But of course, you can't really deal with human motion that way. So there's no real way to slow yourself down so that you all speed up correctly. And some were on wires, they flew, they twirled around. It was very complicated. They worked for months and months. They couldn't use any of that stuff.
I remember we shot a lot of different things that failed. A lot of different versions of the extraterrestrials that ultimately didn't work out, and then there was one where I was supposed to kind of enter this anti-gravity thing and go floating up, and it didn't really work because they didn't know how to do it.
When the little alien comes out at the end, the star alien that we get to actually, or Truffaut gets to actually do the thing to, and they look and they smile, and it's a very sweet scene. They were doing it at that point with one of the young ballet students coming out in their alien costume and doing their best to make the sign and to communicate with Truffaut. But it didn't really look that convincing. I mean, one of the problems I remember was that the rubber hands were just these rubber hands with long fingers. And when it went like this, you could kind of see the rubber crinkling up at the edges, and it was kind of hard to do, and the facial expressions weren't so great. So later on, when the movie was finished, we all came back months and months later on a stage in Los Angeles at Columbia, and we redid it with a wonderful, very articulated puppet that Carlo Rambaldi built that could do millions of things and was probably a forerunner to E.T. in some way, the way he worked, the way he moved, his great facial expressions, so you could really get close and cut back and forth between.
This huge steel rig with big arc lights on it and par lights and all kinds of bright, vivid lights on this metal rig that was hung from a cable on a crane, and the crane, which was behind the set, had to move this arm over the set, and Rick Dreyfuss and Melinda were all going to duck, when it went over. The trouble was the crane operator couldn't see them because it was on the other side of the set, and the crane was reaching way over, and it was actually abandoned. So we shot those scenes with a 65mm camera. We had an off-camera arc light that would pass a pool of light past them, and they'd all look at, some non-existent thing fly by. And everybody was keeping their fingers crossed because we hadn't shot one working saucer at that time. It was all for post-production. I think at the time when we started, pretty much everybody on the film who had anything to do with design or production design had certainly seen a lot of purported photographs of flying saucers. Everybody knew they were supposed to be a disc, and they were supposed to have a little bubble on the top or whatever. And there was kind of a 50s mindset about what a flying saucer would look like, and that's where we all started. And as soon as you could see that on film, you could see that it was a disappointing effect. Steven had this idea that the UFOs were trying to kind of emulate things that they saw on Earth to make us happy or make us feel comfortable. And so one of the UFOs we built was golden arches that looked like a McDonald's sign. And it was an ellipsoidal-shaped UFO that was like one of the single arches. But when two of them flew together and sort of converged for a minute, you'd see this kind of McDonald's logo fly by. There was another logo that was kind of a trapezoid-shaped thing that when two of them lined up, it became a chevron logo for Standard Oil. And there was a globe around orange 76 sign. It was never quite a 76 sign, but it was an orange spherical UFO. Those, I think, were a little over the top and were never finished and not put in the film. And I think it was only until then, and Steven saying, what if it just sort of looked like a 747 coming straight at you with its landing lights on, and you can't really see the fuselage, but you see these bright lights in your face. It's sort of like a plane landing at LAX. And we said, that sounds good, we'll try that. And that idea of Steven's sort of led to the smoke room. And the smoke room was really an idea of how to create a miniature atmosphere. Because if you saw a plane flying toward you at night with big beams of light coming out of it, you have to have some way of making that beam of light show up in the atmosphere. We built this completely black velvet room that was about 60 feet long and about 30 feet across and 20 feet high, with a kind of a closed air conditioning system that would circulate air in the room. And in the air circulation system was a smoke-making machine that would inject smoke into the room. The room was completely surrounded by fans that would circulate the air completely evenly throughout the room. It turned out that the exact shape of the UFO was not very important, just some very simple conical or curved or sort of hamburger-shaped plastic object. But on that object would be mounted various shapes of very bright lights or pieces of bent neon or a combination of lights inside through holes. And if we wanted the beams of light, we'd shoot an exposure in smoke, and that would create beams of light. But if we wanted a very bright lens flare, which is a different effect of sort of a ring, a halo of light around the UFO that's occurring in the camera lens, we'd shoot that without smoke. So those would be two different exposures. And sometimes a UFO would be made up of 7 different types of exposures at different levels and different colors.
Where everybody points to the sky and says, "Ugh." Every day on the way back from location at night, I would pass this huge oil refinery with like 10,000, 50-watt bulbs everywhere and tubes and pipes, and it was just so complicated and so industrial that I thought, rather than romancing the mothership with a piece of mystery blotting out the stars, why not let the mothership be this huge, city in the sky that goes from place to place? And all I really did was I gave Ralph McQuarrie the concept of this oil refinery that I had seen, and maybe the lights of the San Fernando Valley, upside down.
Steven had seen work that I'd done for Star Wars. I was a production illustrator on Star Wars. He apparently had passed this oil refinery and it sort of clicked with him. So I started with that premise, and they said, well, just go ahead and make a painting based on what we discussed, if I recall it right. And I went home and spent a day and a half or 2 making this rendering, which showed pretty much what we see in the film.
After we saw the Ralph McQuarrie sketch, I went to the back room and we started putting together this little mothership right here. And it was just made out of pieces of wood and wire. And once we made it, we just said, well, Doug, you want to show this to somebody and see if it looks good? And he and Steven got together and they wound up saying, well, this looks pretty good. Let's just go sort of with this design, incorporating with Ralph McQuarrie's design aspects. And this was like the springboard for the final version of the mothership.
It was a funny concept because one of the designs was a huge disc-shaped object on one side of it, kind of a bowl-shaped thing, out of which would come this trapezoid-shaped object. And in fact, that shape was like a huge breast and nipple, which everybody thought, well, that's the mothership for sure. That's the sort of subliminal image behind that giant descending breast. The top of it was these series of towers that were kind of a composite of the idea of an oil refinery with a lot of ducts and tubes, but it was also subliminally kind of trying to suggest scale by looking like New York skyscrapers. The tubes had lots of little holes drilled in them and neon lights that were all specially bent by a neon artist named Larry Albright.
Larry Albright has been doing lots of very exotic neon over the past 20 years or so. He custom bent all the neon that goes into the little so-called cigar tubes that are drilled with little holes all over them. Contrary to public belief, they're not cigar tubes. They're actually different diameter aluminum tubes that everybody, when they didn't have anything to do, even Steven was out there drilling holes in them.
I was involved with photographing the mothership. Greg Jean and his model crew had made it, and Doug Trumbull was setting up the shots. Richard Yursich was making sure all the stuff was together at the right place at the right time. Steven would come in and lay each shot out as we were doing them, put the camera in the right place, figure the start point and the stop point on it. And then it would be up to me and Scott Squires would be there all day long, setting it up and shooting a pass. Then at nighttime, Hoyt Yateman would come in and sit there for 12 hours at night and make sure that it ran okay during the night. And Scott and I would come in again in the morning and finish the shot out. Most of the shots took a day and a half or 2 days to shoot. The mothership, essentially, we shot 2 of them. There was the underbelly of the mothership that was probably about 5 feet across, and that's the one that has the light patterns on it. The other model was the entire mothership that was a little bit smaller than that.
Bob Swarth, who was in charge of all the stars and the animation and flat art, actually animated these slots of blue light or red light or green light that synchronized with the music, which all had to be performed ahead of time by John Williams in order for us to have the music cues.
I was given a music track that just had the tuba sounds on it, and we just made up a cue sheet of every single sound, and then I worked out the lighting cues on the mothership. I knew what the kind of colors they were using on the light board because I had seen that footage, but as I recall, nobody told me what colors to use for anything. I just did what I felt, you know, would work, and it all sunk up correctly. It was all cut in, worked beautifully.
As the sequence was wrapping up, suddenly we found out that Steven wanted the end credits to be over the mothership. So I got a chance to design some of the shots. And it was really looking for interesting parts of the frame that the mothership might be and how big the ship might be in the frame. Whether it was going to be small up in the corner, whether it was going to be big moving through. I mean, that was really a lot of fun. That was more of the type of work I'd done in Star Wars, where I could sort of design shots and we could use them in the film. And the room we had was too small to actually get the camera back very far, even with the widest angle lens. So we got one of those convex mirrors and sort of put it in one corner of the room and looked into that at the mothership. So it made the mothership look like it was 150 feet away instead of like 30 feet away because it was reflected in this dome. So we managed to get a couple of shots that way. So we had to do a lot of stuff like that. And it was hard, again, because this thing weighed 100 or 200 pounds. The camera gear alone had to weigh 100 pounds. The tracks that the cameras were on weighed at least 100 or 200 pounds. It was very hard to move any of the gear around. And that's one of the things that I don't miss about the old special effects was the weight and the difficulty in moving things around. Now that we do most of the stuff computer generated, the stuff doesn't weigh anything. So it's, and you can put the camera wherever you want.
This is my first movie with Steven. We lived in the same house in Mobile, Alabama, and I had my editing room at the house. So I'd roll out of bed and go to work, and then, you know, it was right there. I'd have to waste 2 or 3 hours traveling. So he was accessible each evening. We'd run over material, and he'd give me his thoughts, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience that way. It was really that